Welcome, seekers of insight and truth. If you've ever wondered why you react the way you do, why certain thoughts feel so personal, or what truly lies behind the mask you call me, then this video is for you. Today, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood forces shaping your life, the ego. Far beyond pride or self-importance, the ego is a complex structure silently guiding your choices, relationships, and even your sense of reality. But here's the twist. What if the very you think you are isn't really you? In this video, we'll explore and uncover how the ego is formed, how it both serves and sabotages us, its role in shaping psychological development and its significance in philosophical inquiry, and how transcending its grip can lead to profound freedom. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you won't just understand the ego, you might begin to see through it. The ego, it's one of the most central elements of the human psyche, yet also one of the most elusive and often misunderstood. It shapes our sense of self, coloring the way we think, feel, act, and relate to the world around us. We often hear the term ego used in the context of arrogance or self-importance. But in truth, the ego is far more complex than that. It can be a powerful tool for personal growth, helping us navigate the world, set goals, and build identity. Yet at the same time, it can be a source of deep inner conflict and suffering. The ego acts as a double-edged force in our lives. And as we come to understand its nature, where it originates, how it influences us, we also begin to uncover something more. A path toward transcendence. A way to move beyond the ego's limitations and access deeper levels of consciousness, clarity, and true inner freedom. The formation of the ego begins early, often in childhood, right alongside the first flickers of self-awareness. It's that moment when a child begins to notice the boundary between themselves and the world around them. They start to distinguish me from not me, and this subtle shift in perception marks the beginning of the ego. As language and thought begin to develop, the ego emerges as both a translator and a protector, mediating between the child's inner impulses and the external world. It helps balance instinctual drives, the pressure of social norms, and the growing sense of right and wrong. Over time, this simple structure evolves. Personal experiences, family dynamics, education, cultural narratives, all of these begin to shape and mold the ego. What starts as a survival mechanism becomes something more complex, a psychological identity made up of beliefs, roles, memories, attachments, and aversions. This identity helps us navigate the world. It gives us a name, a role, a place to stand. But it can also become a cage, limiting how we see ourselves and confining our awareness to a narrow, conditioned sense of who we think we are. In psychological frameworks, the ego is seen as the part of the mind that manages perception, thought, and behavior. It helps us interpret reality, regulate our emotions, and make sense of our experiences. At its core, the ego is a mediator, working to balance our inner desires with the expectations of the outer world. It weaves these threads together to create a stable sense of self that persists through time. When the ego is well integrated, it becomes a vital ally. It supports emotional resilience, helps us adapt to challenges, and fosters healthy, meaningful relationships. In this balanced state, the ego serves not as an obstacle, but as a foundation for grounded, conscious living. However, psychological disturbances often arise when the ego moves out of balance. When it becomes inflated, it can manifest as narcissism, rigidity, or an excessive need for control. On the other hand, when the ego is underdeveloped, it may lead to feelings of vulnerability, confusion around identity, or deep dependency on others. To protect itself from discomfort, the ego employs various defense mechanisms, like repression, denial, or projection. These tools serve a purpose. They help us manage emotional pain and maintain psychological stability, especially in times of stress. But when they're overused, they begin to backfire. They can distort how we see ourselves and the world around us, limiting emotional growth and keeping us stuck in patterns that no longer serve us. In philosophy, the ego isn't regarded as something fixed or permanent. Rather, it's seen as a mental construct, a pattern of activity, not a solid self. Many philosophers question the very notion of a stable, unchanging identity. From this perspective, what we call the ego is really just a collection, a bundle of thoughts, sensations, and memories that we mistakenly identify as me. It clings to labels, seeks control, and searches for certainty in a world that's in constant flux. It resists the unknown, afraid of losing its grip, but at its core, the ego is empty. Not meaningless, but not the ultimate truth of who we are. It's a temporary mask, not the face beneath it. Now, this doesn't mean the ego is useless. Far from it. The ego serves an important function. It helps us relate, communicate, make decisions, and navigate the complexities of life. But it's important to understand it for what it is, not our essence, but a tool. A kind of mask we wear to move through the world. Many philosophical traditions point to something deeper beneath that mask, a vast, quiet awareness, open, spacious, and untouched by the personal stories we tell ourselves. And accessing that deeper self doesn't require battling the ego. Instead, it calls for seeing through it, stepping back from the constant chatter of the mind and realizing we are the witness behind it all. So let's take a closer look at the ego, not as something to reject, but as a vital part of the human experience. It often goes unappreciated, yet it plays powerful roles in our lives. The ego gives us a sense of identity and continuity. It weaves our memories, experiences, and emotions into a coherent narrative, a story that connects our past, present, and future. Without it, life would feel fragmented, like a puzzle with no image to guide us. The ego also helps us make choices. It evaluates options, considers consequences, and directs us toward goals that give life meaning. It's what gives our actions shape and intention. And when it's in balance, when the ego works in harmony with deeper awareness, it becomes a source of inspiration. It drives us to grow, to learn, to express our gifts, not to become someone else, but to evolve into fuller, more authentic versions of who we already are. Let's explore how the ego impacts human life, beginning with the constructive side of the story. The ego gives us a sense of identity and continuity. It weaves our experiences into a coherent narrative, allowing us to understand who we are across time. Without it, life could feel disjointed, like moments without meaning. It also plays a key role in decision-making and agency. The ego helps us weigh options, consider risks, and take purposeful action. It's what allows us to function independently, making choices that reflect our goals and values. And when it's in balance, the ego becomes a powerful motivator. It drives us to learn, to grow, to strive for something greater. It fuels ambition, not out of vanity, but from a desire to evolve into our fullest potential. The ego also gives us the psychological drive to set meaningful goals and the motivation to pursue them. It's what pushes us to achieve, to improve, to reach beyond where we are now. And on a social level, the ego helps us navigate the world around us. It allows us to adopt roles, follow norms, and engage with others in ways that create structure and connection. It's through the ego that we learn to cooperate, communicate, and find our place in society. But the ego isn't without its darker side. When left unchecked, it can lead to a range of destructive tendencies that shape how we see ourselves and how we relate to the world. The ego creates a sense of duality. It draws a hard line between self and other, which can lead to feelings of separation, isolation, even hostility. This divide often fuels prejudice, rivalry, and the breakdown of social unity. It also fears loss. When the ego is wrapped up in image, possessions, or control, anything that threatens its carefully constructed story becomes a source of anxiety, jealousy, and attachment. Criticism, failure. The ego takes it personally. It reacts defensively, sometimes lashing out, sometimes retreating, just to protect its fragile sense of self. And then there's the constant craving for validation. The ego seeks recognition, praise, admiration. But the more it chases approval from the outside, the more insatiable that hunger becomes. Ultimately, the ego distorts how we perceive reality. Its biases and projections shape what we see, what we expect, and how we suffer. Let's take a moment to explore what we mean by the transcendence of the ego. Now, this isn't about destroying the ego or making it disappear. Instead, it's about gently reintegrating it into a broader, more expansive awareness. It means shifting our sense of identity away from the narrative-bound self, the one caught up in stories and labels, and toward the quiet, observing consciousness that simply watches. This shift brings with it a sense of clarity, a deep inner peace, and ultimately a profound liberation. One of the first steps on this path is cultivating metacognition, developing the ability to observe our own thoughts. Practices like meditation, mindful breathing, or journaling allow us to step back and become the witness. From this vantage point, we begin to see our thoughts for what they truly are: temporary, fleeting, not who we are. And with that insight, we start to loosen our unconscious identification with them. From here, we begin to embrace psychological flexibility. We realize that our thoughts, emotions, and even our identities are fluid. They're constantly changing. And when we let go of rigid roles or fixed self-concepts, we find more freedom, more ease. This release opens the door to conscious, creative responses rather than automatic reactions shaped by habit or fear. Detachment, too, takes on a new meaning, not as withdrawal, but as clear, grounded engagement. True detachment means showing up fully in life, committed, present, but not clinging to specific outcomes or identities. It empowers us to act with integrity, without being ruled by pride, fear, or expectation. And it builds a kind of quiet strength, an emotional resilience that moves with life, not against it. As ego loosens its grip, something beautiful emerges: empathy. The ego feeds on separation, on the illusion of me versus you. But compassion reveals the deeper truth, that we're all interconnected. By cultivating empathy, altruism, and a sense of shared humanity, we dissolve the isolating walls of ego and enter a more spacious, relational way of being. And finally, all of this rests on a foundation of presence. The ego often lives in the past, dwelling on regrets, or in the future, anxious about what might come. But presence brings us back, here, now. In the present moment, the noise of ego begins to quiet, and we come home to the simplicity of direct experience. Practices like mindful walking, creative expression, or contemplative silence can help us ground in this awareness, where stillness meets life, and the ego gently dissolves into something greater. The shadow ego subconscious power structures. Beneath the surface of the visible ego lies something deeper, more hidden. A shadow structure, an unconscious realm where suppressed desires, buried fears, and unresolved experiences reside. These hidden forces don't disappear. Instead, they show up in projections, when we see in others what we can't face in ourselves. They surface in compulsive behaviors, in reactions that seem out of step with our conscious values. This shadow ego thrives in darkness. It resists introspection. It hides behind distractions, justifications, and rationalizations, creating inner tension and keeping reactive patterns alive. But this deeper layer isn't something to fear. With honest self-inquiry and emotional transparency, the shadow can be brought into the light. Only then can it be understood, integrated, and healed. The spiritual ego, a subtle trap. As we begin to loosen our grip on the egoic identity, a new challenge can arise: the spiritual ego. It's subtle and often harder to detect. It forms when the identity shifts from "I'm important" to "I am more evolved." It's the part that quietly clings to the idea of being awakened, superior, or enlightened. This version of ego can wear humility like a costume, all while harboring comparison and hidden pride. It can turn even spiritual growth into a competition. To transcend the spiritual ego, we have to go one step further. We let go of the need to be anything at all, not even awakened. We release the idea of transcendence as something to achieve, and instead we rest in the awareness that is already here, spacious, silent, free from all labels. Let us now explore how different spiritual and traditional paths understand the nature of the ego, beginning with the Vedic perspective. Ego and the Vedas, the play of Maya and Atman. In the vast tapestry of Vedic wisdom, the ego is not regarded as the essence of one's being, but as a construct, the ahamkara, or I-maker. It arises within the subtle body emerging from Maya, the cosmic illusion that conceals the true self, or Atman. This illusion creates a sense of separateness, making the individual believe they are distinct from the universal reality. Yet the Vedic path does not call for the ego's destruction. Instead, it invites a profound realization. The Atman is not the ego. Liberation, moksha, comes when this insight dawns. Through meditation, devotion, and inner inquiry, the ahamkara dissolves into the recognition of unity with Brahman, the infinite consciousness. As Maya lifts, the self is revealed in its eternal wholeness. Let us turn to the Kabbalistic tradition to uncover its insights on the concept of ego. In the mystical teachings of Kabbalah, the ego is intimately bound to the desire to receive, a fundamental quality embedded in the soul. But this desire is not inherently flawed. It wears two faces, one that seeks only for the self, and another that yearns to receive in order to give. When the ego turns inward, clinging to self-gratification, it distorts the vessel, the klai, that was fashioned to hold the divine light. This light, the infinite abundance of the Creator, is not meant to be hoarded, but channeled. A vessel filled only for its own sake becomes sealed off from its true purpose, disconnected from the flow of spiritual vitality. Yet the desire to receive need not be extinguished. In Kabbalistic thought, particularly in the teachings of Baal HaSulam, the path of transformation is not denial but refinement. The soul is called not to renounce its yearning but to elevate it, to receive not for the self alone but in order to bestow. In this way the vessel is purified. It aligns itself with the nature of the Creator, whose essence is absolute giving. In this great paradox lies the key to spiritual ascent. By reshaping the ego, by redirecting the will to receive toward love, service and unity, the vessel is restored. Divine light flows freely once more, not as a private possession, but as a shared abundance, nourishing both the individual soul and the greater whole. In the mystical teachings of Kabbalah, the ego is intertwined with the desire to receive, a force central to the soul's makeup. Yet this desire wears two faces. One that grasps only for itself, and another that seeks to receive in order to give. When the ego turns inward, clinging to self-satisfaction, it distorts the vessel, the kli that was designed to hold divine light, the ore. In its distorted state, the vessel becomes closed, cut off from the source it longs to receive from. The divine flow cannot reach a vessel that hoards. It is only through inner transformation that the soul's true purpose is awakened. The spiritual journey then involves transforming the vessel, refining the ego so it serves a higher aim. This is not a path of denial, but of elevation. The ego is not destroyed, it is redirected. Through acts of generosity, humility, and focused intention, kavana, the soul aligns itself with the Creator's nature, which is pure bestowal. In this elevated state, the ego no longer seeks to accumulate for its own sake. It becomes a transparent channel, a vessel that receives in order to give. The soul becomes receptive to the divine light, not by grasping, but by opening. And in this state, the ego no longer hoards, but becomes a channel for spiritual illumination. This is the paradox of Kabbalistic wisdom, that true reception occurs only when the desire is sanctified by purpose, when receiving becomes a form of giving. In transforming the self, the vessel is restored. The light flows freely, not as a possession, but as a living radiance for the self and for the world. Ego, according to the Talmudic view, the balance of inclinations. Talmudic tradition explores ego through the lens of two inner forces, the Yetzer Hatov, good inclination, and the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination. The ego is associated with the Yetzer Hara not as something inherently bad, but as a powerful, self-driven energy. Rather than seeking to suppress it, the wisdom of the Talmud teaches that this inclination must be directed. When guided by conscience, law, and ethical insight, the ego can become a source of creativity, ambition, and constructive power. Spiritual maturity is found in the balance between desire and discipline, self-expression and self-restraint. In this harmony, the ego serves a sacred role in the human journey. Let us now turn to the subtle ways in which ego seeks control and how this longing shapes our experience of life. There is a quiet illusion that runs through much of human life, the belief that control brings safety, meaning, and mastery. The ego, ever vigilant, clings to this illusion with relentless tenacity. It seeks to shape outcomes, manage perceptions, and direct the behavior of others, constructing a world that feels certain and predictable. But life, by its very nature, resists containment. It moves like water, fluid, unpredictable, and ungraspable. The more the ego tightens its grip, the more life slips through its fingers, leaving behind frustration and suffering. True freedom arises not in conquering life, but in surrendering to it. And surrender is not weakness or resignation. It is a courageous openness, a softening of the need to control. In letting go of the illusion that control ensures security or significance, something extraordinary happens. A deeper intelligence begins to reveal itself, not born of personal will, but of the spontaneous rhythm of existence. When the ego's grasp loosens, we are carried not by force, but by the effortless current of life itself. There is a common misconception that the ego is either an enemy to be destroyed or the truest version of ourselves. In truth, it is neither. The ego serves as a bridge, linking unconscious instinct with conscious presence. It is not the destination, but a passage. When left unexamined, the ego becomes a source of conflict and illusion, casting shadows over our perceptions and entangling us in reactive patterns. But when brought into the light of awareness, it transforms. It becomes a mirror, one that reflects not only our limitations but also our hidden strengths and untapped potential. The journey through ego is not linear. It is a cycle, a spiraling path that begins with its formation in early identity, moves through challenge and insight, and eventually returns us to something deeper, an impersonal awareness that rests behind all names and forms. This awareness does not erase identity but holds it gently, without clinging. By weaving together ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding, we begin to see the ego not as something to be conquered, but as something to be honored, a necessary part of the human experience. Its transcendence comes not through denial or suppression, but through loving clarity. We see through it, not away from it. To truly know, the ego is to outgrow its narrow definitions, and to outgrow it is to awaken. In awakening, we do not become more, but less entangled, less separate, less afraid. What remains is stillness, presence, and a quiet luminosity, the essence that was never apart from us. Thank you for watching the video so far. We hope it's helped you uncover new insights about the nature of ego, how it forms, how it influences us, and why it often feels so real. In this next section, we'll go even deeper, investigating the ego through the latest insights from brain science. We'll explore what modern neuroscience says about identity, illusion, and how the brain constructs the self. If you're enjoying this journey into the mind, please consider subscribing and supporting the channel. It really helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's continue. The exploration of ego is no longer confined to philosophy and spiritual traditions. It has entered the realm of neuroscience and cognitive psychology with increasing clarity. What was once treated as a metaphysical abstraction is now examined through brain imaging, behavioral experiments, and computational modeling. This emerging view reveals that the ego is not a singular structure, but an emergent, dynamic pattern of neural activity, distributed, adaptable, and intrinsically relational. The experience of self, the unmistakable feeling of I am, doesn't arise from a single command center buried in the brain. Instead, it's woven from the activity of multiple neural networks, each contributing a thread to the tapestry of identity. Modern neuroscience reveals the ego not as a fixed entity, but as a living, breathing construction, shaped by sensation, memory, and the brain's constant attempts to predict what comes next. At the heart of this intricate process lies a network known as the default mode network, or DMN. This ensemble of regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, tends to come alive when we turn inward. When we drift into thought, revisit old memories, imagine what's ahead, or reflect on who we are, the DMN hums into action. It's here that the narrative self takes shape, the inner monologue, the storyline that gives our lives a sense of continuity. But you know, the DMN can also trap us. Overactivity in this network has been linked to cycles of rumination, depressive thought patterns, and the tightening grip of ego-centered concerns. Interestingly, practices like mindfulness meditation appear to quiet this inner narrator. As DMN activity decreases, so does the weight of egoic identity, making space for a more grounded awareness of the present. Working alongside the DMN are two other major players, the salience network and the executive control network. The salience network, anchored in the anterior insular and anterior cingulate cortex, acts like a vigilant sentinel. It scans both the inner world and the outer environment, flagging what feels urgent, personal, or emotionally charged. This is where the brain decides what matters to me. Meanwhile, the executive control network steps in as the planner and regulator. It helps us choose, restrain, and execute, functions that are often tied to willpower and a strong sense of agency. Together, these three systems form a kind of internal triad. One spins the story, another signals importance, and the third charts a course forward. The ego emerges not from any one of them, but from the ongoing negotiation between all three, a dynamic tension that gives rise to the ever-changing sense of who we are. The self, as we commonly experience it, a coherent I at the center of thought and action, may be little more than a clever illusion. Cognitive science now suggests that this sense of self is not a concrete entity, but a mental construct, a simulation the brain runs to help us survive, adapt, and connect. Like a user interface on a computer, the self offers a simplified, functional model of something vastly more complex beneath the surface. This model is predictive in nature. To navigate the world effectively, the brain must anticipate outcomes, evaluate risks, and regulate internal balance. The result? A looping construct of identity. Each time the brain references its internal self model, it strengthens the illusion that a stable self is really there. The more the story is told, the more believable it becomes. Yet when this self is examined closely, whether through philosophical inquiry or scientific experimentation, it begins to unravel. There is no fixed core, no unchanging observer behind the eyes. Instead, we find an ongoing mental narration, a process rather than a presence. What remains isn't the ego itself, but the tendency to identify with certain patterns of thought, emotion, and perception. The self isn't a solid structure, it's a story the brain tells itself over and over again. Beneath the surface of our thoughts, the ego is not just narrating, it's guarding. Wired into the brain's emotional circuitry, the ego acts as a kind of sentry, constantly scanning for threats, not only to the body, but to the story of who we believe we are. When something challenges that story, a criticism, a failure, even silence, it can register as danger. Early attachment experiences, our first emotional blueprints, shape how the ego will defend itself in the years to come. A secure ego can flex, reflect, and grow. A fragile one clings, distorts, and protects itself at all costs. In both cases, the brain is doing its best to defend the narrative of self, but not always in the way that leads to clarity or peace. The ego may feel like a permanent fixture of our inner world, but the brain tells a different story. Thanks to neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to rewire itself, the boundaries of ego are not set in stone. Contemplative practices, particularly long-term meditation, have proven to reshape this architecture. Experienced meditators show heightened activation in the insula and greater engagement of prefrontal regions involved in attention and regulation. At the same time, the DMN, the great narrator of the self, quiets down. Even short bursts of mindfulness training can create measurable changes in connectivity. In this view, the ego starts to look less like an identity and more like a habit. And like any habit, it can be unlearned. The frontier of psychedelic research brings a more dramatic perspective. Substances like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT have been shown to temporarily disrupt the DMN in striking ways. Users report experiences of ego dissolution, where the boundaries of the self fall away. Brain scans during these episodes reveal increased global connectivity, as if the mind is suddenly free to communicate across regions that are normally siloed. What we find beyond the ego is not emptiness, but a deeper truth, one that has been waiting, quietly, beneath the story we tell ourselves. Though much is made of transcending the ego, neuroscience offers a more nuanced perspective. It doesn't call for the ego's destruction, but for its integration. The ego is not an enemy, it's a function. It helps us navigate the complexities of memory, prediction, and social interaction. The problem arises not in having an ego, but in being ruled by it. This is where meta-awareness enters the picture. When the brain gains the capacity to witness its own thoughts without being fully absorbed by them, the ego loses its grip. Over time, the boundaries of identity soften, not into formlessness, but into responsiveness. The ego, from a neuroscientific standpoint, is neither fixed nor inherently flawed. It is an adaptive simulation. Modern neuroscience and psychology show that the ego is both real in function and illusory in essence, a pattern that serves life but is not life itself. To transcend ego is not to become less human, but to become more whole. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. We truly hope it brought you insight, clarity, and maybe even a little peace on your journey of understanding the ego. If this exploration resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thinker's Journey. Show your support by liking, commenting, and sharing. Helps us reach more thoughtful minds like yours. Let's keep growing this community of awareness and inquiry together. Until next time, keep your mind open, your awareness sharp, and your spirit grounded. This has been a journey into the self with Thinker's Journey, Tihan.